I'm Gareth from the Art Newspaper. Um, we're starting a monthly book club, and we're kicking off with. Here's Blake. Let me just go live. Hopefully, Mr. Gopnik will be joining me, and he can talk about the Andy Warhol biography because we are starting a monthly book club. Hi,
There we
Blake.
are. Hey, Gareth, how are you?
I am so relieved to see you. Technical glitches and everything like that. How are
I
you
can't
doing?
imagine this is working. In fact, we'll see what happens. I'm
We
great.
will.
I'm great.
You look
I'm
very
glad to.
clear.
Good. I'm glad to see we have the same barber. I approve wholeheartedly of your haircut. Look at that. Yes, it's the Bald Man Club.
But how are you doing that on lockdown? I've got a skull shaver. Have you got a skull shaver?
I do. I do. Yeah, it's not usually quite as short as this, but it only had one setting, so I'm stuck with very, very
Exactly. But we're
short
lucky,
hair.
aren't we?
It
But I
makes
was
life
just,
easy.
it does. But I was just explaining that the art newspaper's starting a book club, and every month we're going to do two or three different. Every week we'll do two or three different things online, small things like Q&As with curators, catalogue of the week, that kind of thing. But the main kind of strand is something called Book of the Month, and of course we want to start with this.
There we go. It looks
So
excellent.
it does actually, yeah. So I know it's been quite a momentous time for you. I think this was published a few weeks ago in Europe or the UK, especially by Alan Lane. But it was published yesterday in the US, is that
That's
right?
right, exactly. It was published in the UK just before you guys shut down. So I got to give one talk at the Tate, and then I had to come running back to New York before I'd be kept out for good. And
All
now, of course,
right.
it's published here in New York, and we're completely shut down.
And how, I mean, I know it must have been quite a special day for you yesterday. I guess perhaps you're skipping solo down Fifth Avenue, I'm not sure. But
That's right.
what kind of, I mean, I saw your Instagram post and I think you said you had a tear in your eye. Was it because you wrote the last word in January?
Yeah, I didn't have a tear in my eye. I had tears rolling down my face at some ungodly hour of the morning when I wrote the last word in the book. Because
Oh,
I always
really?
knew the last word was going to describe his last heartbeat. I didn't want the book to do the aftermath. I wanted to end then. So when I wrote that word, I knew I was done. And I never thought I'd finish it. So I was just dissolved. I was laughing and crying at the same time.
And it's kind of devoured your life for how long? I mean, 7 years? Is it? How long has
Yeah,
the
seven, going
process
on
been?
eight now. Going on
Oh, is
eight
it?
now. Yeah,
Okay.
it's been quite something.
So I think you said to me on the phone on Monday, it was very interesting. Everything you encountered in the past 7 years, you kind of linked to Warhol. Has that kind of stopped now? Your brain has stopped working in that way?
It just barely stopped. I mean, it really was the case that for a little while towards the end of the project, I couldn't not play a word association game with everything tying it to Warhol. I mean, it was really madness. And I have a few neurons now that are starting to empty Warhol out of them. But for a long time, there was nothing but Warhol in my mind.
Because that's what I wanted to ask you first about the research process, really. I mean, did you decamp to Pittsburgh? What, I mean, are there any archives you found particularly important and revelatory? What happened? How did it come together?
Warhol must be the best documented artist just about of all time. I mean, in Pittsburgh at the Andy Warhol Museum, they have his archives, which is just, I mean, there's 610 of these crazy time capsules filled with all sorts of stuff. And then there's a whole other room or two full of cardboard boxes with invoices, ticket stubs. I mean, just mention it, and he kept it. But then there are archives all over. There are archives that have recordings of him talking to Sam Green, the curator. There are archives, Yale has papers. The New York Public Library has amazing material. So I really
Okay.
ran around looking for anything having to do with Warhol and finding much, much, much too much. That was the problem.
Because that's what's interesting. I know you've posted a separate sort of compendium of footnotes on the HarperCollins website. Is that true?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's 750 pages just of endnotes. 7,351, I think, at last count, endnotes. It may be the most heavily footnoted biography of all time because it was really important to me to tell people exactly where I learned what I learned. And the footnotes
Yeah.
are full of deep incidental detail explaining how I came to a conclusion.
It's quite incredible. I mean, is it 976? You can kind of park a small car on this, I feel.
Yeah,
And
funnily enough, the British one uses a slightly thicker paper, so it's a more of a telephone book. In the United States, they managed to find a thinner paper, so it doesn't look quite as imposing, but the content is identical, and it is
okay.
almost 1,000 pages. I'm ashamed to say it is almost 1,000 pages. People
Okay.
say it
Well,
doesn't, when you read it, it really doesn't feel like more than like 950.
no, exactly. I mean, it's good. It's in turn gossipy. It's pretty exhaustive, entertaining, I have to say. And one thing I did want to say to people watching now is please, any of you want to comment, send a quick question, please send them because Blake is ready and able,
Oh, I would
obviously.
love to answer some questions. The harder, the better. The more vicious, the better.
Um, we also talked as well earlier this week about some of the takeaways you've got from the book, and you did a very interesting kind of Twitter platform thing with Blackwell's book publishers or booksellers a
Yeah.
few weeks ago, and there were some superb takeaways in that. And the first one that really stood out for me was the Outlines Gallery in Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
So I didn't know anything about that. I assume this is when Andy was attending college. He kind of, is that right? Is it around the same
It's
time?
just before, actually, he's attending
Okay,
college, even. So, really, his late teenage years were spent in this gallery in Pittsburgh, this improbably superb avant garde gallery for modern art, modern film, even modern theater. When I came across it, I actually, almost purely by luck, someone gave me a tip and I found the scrapbooks from this extraordinary gallery. I mean, its existence was known, but I don't think anyone, at least among Warholians, had really dug into just how amazing a facility this was.
it's incredible. I mean, in the book, that part is particularly enjoyable. Didn't they attend a John Cage lecture? It's quite interesting what they saw. Him and is it
Yeah.
Philip Pearlstein? I think that was right. His
Well, all
colleague.
the kids, all of the young artsies in Pittsburgh, and once they got to college, I mean, there was only a year overlap between the gallery and when Warhol was in college, so they
I
mostly saw
see.
it before that. John Cage came a few times, and most importantly, spent a month in a residency with Merce Cunningham. It's the first time they appear as a professional, but also romantic couple. They share an apartment in Pittsburgh.
Oh, interesting. Some questions starting to come in. James
Oh,
Ellis
good.
Sumner, what would Warhol think of the art world in 2020?
I'd like to think he'd be as disgusted as most of the rest of us are. I think, I mean, the market is a whole other issue. He was actually secretly not a big fan of the market. He loved making money, but he knew that it could corrupt art. I think he'd be disappointed that things aren't a little bit more exciting right now, but there have always been
Really?
slow moments. He was an old-fashioned modernist. He believed in the avant-garde, and I'm not sure we have a real avant-garde right now.
Okay. I mean, I know it's an age-old question with Warhol. Was he more interested in the art, the fame, or the money? I mean, it's something that's always rumbled
I
on. What?
answer that really simply. The art,
Yeah.
absolutely. He didn't mind being famous and rich from the art, but he, from a very young age, wanted to be the greatest, most exciting modern artist there could be. I really believe that
Interesting.
profoundly.
Georgina Adam, good
Ah,
colleague of mine from the art newspaper, she's just
indeed,
sent
Georgina.
something. Can you see her? Did it change your view of Warhol? I mean, that's
Yes,
a bit of a
because I hadn't realized any more, I think, than anyone else, just how intelligent he was. I mean, that really did change my view, that he was intelligent in a kind of old-fashioned way. He got pretty good marks in school. He was even on the honor list in high school. Then he had this amazing education in college that I think he really took in. So he wasn't at all the kind of accidental genius people always portray him as, or even a naif. He was a faux naif, and it was completely faux. He was actually a deep sophisticate. And that I hadn't realized properly before I started the book.
and highly intelligent then in that sense, isn't it? The way he adapted
I,
to most situations, I
yeah,
think.
I mean, artistically, had an artistic intelligence that's unrivaled, but he actually had a normal kind of intelligent intelligence as well, I think.
Okay. Looking at some other bits and pieces, I've got some
Yes,
other.
you
Oh,
can see them better than
Javier.
me. Oh,
Javier's got, Javier Pez,
I do
another
indeed.
journalist colleague.
A
He
pleasure
also
to
sent a
hear from
question
him.
previously. He's a big fan of yours.
Ah.
Javier says, was Julia Warhol an art show business mother? I don't know if that means an art show business as such, but I mean, what kind of, she had a huge influence. I know it's a really important
Yeah.
part in the early part of the book. Did we underplay or have we underestimated how powerful she is?
We certainly underestimated it. Was she, I mean, a kind of the equivalent of a stage mother, I think is what
Yeah,
Javier
yeah.
is asking.
I think he is.
And I don't know if yes, in a way she was, because she gave him art supplies as a little kid. I mean, I think most immigrant mothers in Depression era Pittsburgh were not spending their money getting art supplies for their kids. So she was, I mean, the thing I discovered about her that I don't think has ever been really fully acknowledged is she was an eccentric. She was a cultural eccentric, even though she came from the most sort of meager background in Eastern Europe. She was committed to being an unusual and unusually cultured person.
That's so interesting because I singled out a passage about
Ah,
her on page 25, and you say the most important gift Julia gave to her son might have been something you could call the Zavaki way, her maiden name, is it
Zavaki is
such?
her maiden name,
Zavaki,
yeah.
got the intonation wrong. A willingness to be recognized as different and eccentric, and in some indefinable way, a touch more cultured and interesting than others.
Yeah,
And I think that distills everything, doesn't it, about
exactly.
her role and her power as such.
And it wasn't just her. It turns out her brother was similar. I mean, there is to this day a kind of Zavaki compound in Butler,
Hmm.
Pennsylvania, outside of Pittsburgh. And they're still all fascinating, eccentric, interesting people. And I think that was, Warhol is more Zavaki than a Warhola, which was his name before he dropped the A.
Actually, Javier did say to me earlier this week, please ask Blake about Julia Warhola stealing the show in David Bailey's banned ITV profile of Andy Warhol. Did she steal the show?
Oh, I hadn't thought of that. She almost always stole the show. I mean, there were friends of Warhol's who said that she was smarter than him. There's one friend who actually knew her better than he knew Andy, and despite her real difficulty with the English language, her English was very halting. He said it was clear to him that she was more interesting, exciting, and intelligent. And Andy said the same thing on several occasions.
And she lived in the basement, did she, in New York? How did it work?
The family doesn't like it when we use the word basement because it makes it sound as though
Oh,
Andy's stuck her in a dungeon. It was what we call here
lower
an
floor.
English basement.
Okay,
I
okay.
don't think you have English basements in England, but it means a
No.
garden level apartment, and
Okay,
it was not deeply below grade and was perfectly pleasant, though not fancy at all.
I see.
It
Another
looks as though
question.
he made his first paintings there, by the way,
Oh,
in
okay.
her space.
As you say, ever present as such. Guillaume Van Damme, what is one of the greatest myths about Warhol you wanted to dispel in your writing?
Ooh, nice question.
Quite
That he was a
tough.
fool. I also went into some detail, as today's Daily Mail in England is now making clear, to talk about him as not having been asexual. That I think is actually a homophobic myth about Warhol. We don't
Oh,
mind the fact that he was gay, but we don't actually want to think about two men in bed together. Whereas I found, 13 men that I got clear records of him having slept with, and you figure if I know of 13, he slept with 26 or 39 or something. So he was, not a huge sex fiend, but he was definitely sexual in a big way.
so was he out? I think I'm on this part now. Was he out in college as such, or was he exploring, or was it just too risky at that time?
Depends what you mean by out. Everyone must have known. He wore white nail polish. There are pictures of him where he deliberately adopts a more feminine pose than anyone asked for. He once they were all asked to do self-portraits in art class in college, and he did a picture of a little girl in Shirley Temple ringlets, and someone said, "Who's that? Your sister? It's supposed to be a self-portrait." And he said,
Oh,
"No, no, I've
really?
always wanted to know what I look like as a girl." So he already is in drag already in college.
Um, Interesting. Victor White, the artist. Are there any cases when Warhol did not wear his wig? Well, I
Ah,
know that was such an essential part of the persona, isn't it?
yeah, I mean, there are very few cases where he was known to be without his wig. Twice at least, someone grabbed it off his head as a cruel
I
joke.
know.
At least twice, maybe three times. Um, Let me think if there are other cases. Probably his cosmetologist saw him without it. We've got a set of photographs of where he's having a life mask made for an animatronic Warhol they were going to make, which
Oh,
never got
wow.
finished. Or maybe it's finished and I think it is finished and in some storage somewhere. And there are photographs of him without his wig on there, but he really almost never appeared. And in fact, a lot of people didn't know he had a wig. Journalists always talking about his hair. He had all sorts of clever devices we can't go into now for making it look as though it wasn't a wig.
I see. I think it's interesting the Tate Modern show, which of course is sadly closed because of Corona. I think the things that cause most of a stir are the wigs.
Yeah,
It's such a talking point towards the end. I mean, you saw the show. You said you came over,
yeah, I did.
and I mean, people were really crowding around that
Yeah,
case.
it's funny. They look like roadkill, though. I mean, there are
They do.
hundreds of them, hundreds of them that
Are there?
survive in the museum. Yeah, I mean, or maybe 800 at least. I've never counted, and they're quite disgusting because when you've worn something like that, and then 40 years later, it starts looking awfully yellow and sickly and nasty. But they're actually very interesting, more interesting even than they seem once you start to analyze the wigs.
And he was
Yeah.
obsessed, obviously. He would never be without them in any way,
Yeah, I mean,
actually.
once he started wearing them in 53, 54, it's clear that he just keeps them on for the rest of his life. It was his first boyfriend who I had the incredibly good fortune to interview, who suggested that he get a wig, because before that, Andy refused not to go around in a cap. And at dinner in the 1950s, you did not wear your hat to dinner, and it
Oh,
looked
I
just too
see.
stupid.
Just so awkward, though. So self-conscious in every sense in
He
that
was.
way.
He was. I think he was actually awfully good looking, but he didn't think so.
Okay.
Anything
Some
else?
other things that the takeaway stuff, I wanted to go back to those. When you did that with Blackwell's, you said Marilyn is supposed to be his first silk screen of a solo celebrity, with Liz Taylor following later. But you found a letter from June 1962 that already mentions a finished Liz,
Yeah.
which is a bit of a find. I mean, do you want to say a bit more about that?
Well, it's just one of those strange things that it's completely not the way things are supposed to be, and it goes against all the normal stories. And maybe there was a gross error in the postmark, or there's some other explanation for it. I spoke to Irving Blum. It was a letter from Irving Blum to Warhol saying thank you for the
Wow.
Liz Taylor. So it looks as though Liz was actually the first of the stars. I hope that the authors of the catalog raisonné send me a message if I'm wrong, explaining how I'm wrong. I'm willing to accept that. In fact, I'm quite proud of the
Interesting.
fact that I've got a page of corrections and addenda on my warholiana.com website. So I'm
I was
hoping
reading those today. I saw
to
them.
correct that.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, I don't know. The other thing that interests me is the question of whether Marilyn Monroe, whether he silkscreened Marilyn after she died or before. He claimed it was after, but why wouldn't he claim that? That's exactly the better story, to say she died and then heartbroken, I silkscreened her. But there's some evidence possibly that he did it before she died.
Oh, I see. So it has more potency as a kind of death homage as such
Of
in that
course,
kind of
it's a
way.
more powerful story for him to tell. And he always told the most powerful story, no matter how many lies were involved.
I see. Wow. Okay. Alex Fina, what did you learn about how Warhol began Interview magazine? I mean, I'm not on that bit yet, but I mean, was that an interesting thing to document? Did you find anything new about that?
Yeah, I mean, what interests me about Interview, and this isn't my discovery, is that it was actually called a film journal. So it began as part of the high cultural world that Warhol always wanted to inhabit. It wasn't at all what it became in the 70s and 80s and is today. So it's clear that Warhol is still, but it always also had pop cultural elements in it. So it's a fairly serious venture within the territory of sort of an extended field of high art when it starts. And then later it becomes something else. But it certainly, I mean, the story about the founding of Interview magazine is that he did it to get a press pass to the film festival at Lincoln Center. But
I
who
see.
wouldn't give a press pass to Andy Warhol? It just seems absurd to me. He'd been in the film festival a couple of times. He'd done a poster for them. I just can't believe that they said no. So he founded an entire magazine rather than pay the admission to one film festival. That seems like another one of those Warhol myths.
It's interesting that you hinted it changed into something else. Obviously, it began, I guess, as a serious journalistic venture, then became a kind of celebrity vehicle, did it? Is it very
More.
simplistic to say that?
But it was always interesting. It was never a cosmopolitan magazine. It was never a normal celebrity magazine. It was never a people magazine. It was always bizarre because they published these verbatim interviews, often with almost no content in them. So it was always Warholian, if you ask me.
And was he a forerunner of social media in that way, in the most obvious way, and the celebrity is at the forefront of everything in that kind of 21st century way as such?
I think that existed already from the time of Charlie Chaplin. I mean, the notion of celebrity was pretty, or Melba, the great soprano.
I
Celebrity
see.
is built into the 20th century, it seems to me. So, and it dates back, of course, to Lord Byron in the 19th century. So, I'm not convinced by the argument that Warhol's a big forerunner of social media. That's too
Okay.
convenient. I don't like pat situations like that, pat
It's in,
explanations.
I know, it's interesting as well. You say in the Blackwell's thing he wouldn't have liked Instagram, and I think the question that's most popped up when I've said I'm talking to you is would Warhol have been on Instagram? Would he have been on Twitter or whatever? And that comes up
Yeah,
all the time. I think
yeah.
you said he would be into virtual reality or whatever.
He
Made me
would
think
find.
a
I mean,
lot.
if everyone else is doing Instagram and Twitter, I think he'd think it was terribly tired. He hated anything that was old hat. He really, if there's one driving force, it was avoiding the old hat. So he would have done something. I think he would have tried virtual reality and probably failed as badly as anyone else because Warhol made lots of bad art. There was never a period where he didn't make very good art, but he always made a lot of bad art too, at least after the pop period.
And he
Do you have
always
any more
acknowledged.
questions here?
Oh yeah, who
Sorry.
was your intended audience for the book?
Everyone on the planet. I'm hoping to sell, what are we at, 6 billion copies, but we haven't got there yet. It is being translated into lots of languages. No, I really wanted it to appeal to the general audience. I tried to write it in as approachable a way as possible. I wanted it to be very much about the art and help people understand Warhol and the art that he made at the same time. That was really important to me. I want it to be hugely useful to Warhol experts and interesting to Warhol experts, but I also want it, and I hope I've achieved to some extent, want to make it absolutely approachable for anyone who cares about 60s culture, 70s culture, Warhol, art, all sorts of aspects of the 20th century. We'll see if I was
Interesting as well.
successful or not.
Do you think it's a good book for lockdown as well? It is for me personally. I mean, it's just such a good read throughout lockdown.
Well, I did not cause coronavirus. I want that on the record. I
No,
want President Trump to hear that. Like, I don't want to be the latest scapegoat, but it is convenient that people have time to read a 1,000-page book right now.
exactly. Another one from Javier. Why do you think his test films are overlooked?
The screen tests.
I
Um,
guess.
It's a weird situation. They're not overlooked among experts, right? Warhol aficionados, serious ones anyways, all recognize them as great works. I think they're some of his greatest works. I think they are among the greatest portraits ever made. And we should explain that what they are is simply him pointing his 16 millimeter camera, silent, black and white, at a sitter, at a friend, and asking them essentially not to emote and just to stare into the camera or do whatever they want, really. Just be themselves in the camera. And you get these amazing, I think, Rembrandtian portraits of people trying to control their own persona unsuccessfully or trying not to have a persona unsuccessfully. I think they're extraordinary works of art. But of course, they're harder to see because they don't circulate the way an image of a painting does. They're not on YouTube, for instance.
They're not at all. You can't access
There
them
are a
in that kind
few
of way.
illegally on YouTube, but they're not officially distributed by those channels.
Okay. Just one or two more then, other questions. JMRNYC. Robert Rosenblum once told me after seeing the Last Supper pictures about Andy, he just gets better and better. How do you feel about the late work?
I think some of the late work is really good, really excellent. Um, I'm not as big a fan of the Last Supper paintings. I like them fine, but I don't think they go far enough forward from the Mona Lisas that he did in '63. But the camouflage paintings, which are really just reproductions of camouflage patterns in different colors, so that's mostly what they are. I think they're fascinating, and there's lots and lots you can say about them as abstraction, as figuration, as a joke about abstraction and figuration. And also, they look a lot like something that's diseased, so they seem to tie into the AIDS crisis. And then his
Okay.
Rorschach paintings as well, these giant Rorschach blots also strike me as genuinely interesting works.
Okay. Just another takeaway very quickly, because I do want to keep going back to the content as
Ah,
such.
thank you.
The collecting idea as well. I thought it was fascinating that he collected works by Chris Burden. I think that came out,
Yeah,
and Richard Serra. And I think the Burden works were through, is it Ronald Fellman, the dealer? Is that what happened? How did
that's
that
right,
come about?
exactly. Yeah. Um,
I mean, that I didn't realize he was a collector as well. So is that another revelation?
Well, everyone knows that he was a collector of crazy stuff like cookie jars. I mean, he was not just a collector, he was a hoarder as well. He
Forward.
collected bad raw diamonds. I mean, he bought everything. But it was a huge surprise to me to find out that he had a very early Richard Serra prop. I was just in communication with the people doing the Richard Serra catalog raisonné because they hadn't known of this. And I found a
Oh
receipt for it.
wow.
One of these lead works that you prop against a wall. He collected performance mementos by Chris Burden. I mean, absolutely the very most cutting edge work of his moment. Also, Joseph Kosuth. He had Joseph Kosuth really early on, which is
Yeah,
important to me
yeah.
because I think Warhol's a serious conceptual artist, especially in the late 60s and early 70s, making serious conceptual art. And to see him collecting Joseph Kosuth plays into my argument. That was actually one of the most exciting finds for me.
And I guess, did he collect also radio wave pieces by Keith Saunier, this
That's
kind of
right,
thing?
a strange radio piece.
So I guess that all, as you say, feeds into that conceptual idea, doesn't it? As such, feed in his vision, whatever you want to
Yeah.
call it.
And
Okay.
I argue that he was a conceptual artist from the time he made his first Campbell soup can to the day he died, and that there's a conceptual art underpinning even to his most physical looking objects.
Any more? No more questions there. I think what I wanted to just ask you, I mean, we've nearly come to half an hour now, so it's
Oh,
been brilliant. I think it's just
scary.
the right amount of time. Um, I mean, do you think you establish his I mean, you kind of just answered it, but do you think you establish his credibility as an artist in the book? That's been important to you, do you think? Yeah.
I think I established it, but ask several British critics, including one who just wrote, I think, yesterday, saying it's absolutely preposterous to imagine that Andy Warhol is a serious artist. Now, I have to say the line in the book that got me in most trouble was probably the one written with the least thought behind it. It's the last line in the entire book. It's not even in the book. It's
Oh,
in the afterword, where I
oh,
compare him hesitantly in the text to Picasso. There it is.
wow.
And I say, he
Okay.
may have surpassed Picasso as the most influential artist of the 20th century. I think he probably did. And in an awkward rhetorical flourish written at 4 a.m. on the last day of writing under insane deadline, I say he's up on Parnassus with Michelangelo and Raphael and all the other great masters of European art, nice list of dead white males there.
This is
And I
interesting.
thought nothing of it. A, because I think among serious art historians, there's no doubt that he's a major, major figure. And B, those
Yeah.
kind of comparisons are always silly, and I knew I was being silly. But that really got up people's noses that I would dare compare him to Picasso, someone that 50 years ago people would have said, I can't believe he's comparing Picasso to a genuinely great artist like Constable or something.
It's interesting. I've not come to the end, but you say it's looking more and more like Warhol has overtaken Picasso as the most important and influential artist of the 20th century. Or at least the two of them share a spot on the top peak of Parnassus, beside Michelangelo and Rembrandt and their fellow geniuses.
I mean,
Well,
no one's going to, anyone who says that Warhol isn't an awfully interesting artist is a fool. Because whatever you think of him, he is not a trivial artist. It's
no,
very
no.
hard to argue that he doesn't matter for the history of art.
Final question from Farron Ieri, who writes for the New York Times. And Blake, do you like Warhol as a person now that you've written this book? That's the question.
That's a hard one. I kind of don't care. I mean, people keep wanting me to be kind of moralistic and judgmental. And my goal in this whole thing was not to decide whether Warhol was a good person. I think he's a little bit better than many people argue. I've spoken to a lot of young people, especially, to whom he was phenomenally generous. I mean, financially generous with his time. He could be very, very kind. He could also be remote, I think, a lot of the time. But the truth is, judging his morality is not something I'm terribly interested in. And I'm not interested in other biographers who do it. That's not a job that I'm interested in doing. But I do like him more than I expected to like him. Underneath the superficial idiocy, he was actually an intelligent, interesting, and sensitive guy who fell
Okay.
deeply in love a bunch of times. So for me, he's no saint, but he ain't no devil either.
Do you want to take one more question? How much of his public persona was an act and how much was genuine? From Kenneth Kinsley Art.
Almost completely, I don't even like to say an act. It was a very explicit act of self-creation as a work of art, I believe. And in the book, one of the things I'm, in a sense, proudest of is tying him into other artists at exactly that moment, members of the Fluxus movement, and especially the Argentine Alberto Greco, who were doing explicit self-creation as an art form, making it explicit that the gap between art and life had to be removed. Of course, Rauschenberg starts that already. And I really see Warhol's public performances, his public persona, as a relatively mainstream but avant-garde artistic gesture for that moment in the 1960s. So yeah, I think it was almost entirely an act.
That's a really good sentence to end on. I think. It's been
There we
half an
go.
hour. It's been brilliant. Thanks, Blake, for giving us
Thanks.
your
It's been a
time. It's been
pleasure, Gary.
so good. And
Take care.
so we should say that published by who again in the US? Where can you get
By Echo,
this?
which is an imprint of HarperCollins. It's available at all of your indie bookstores, and their websites in the United States is bookshop.org and indiebound.com, but also, of course, Amazon, Barnes& and Noble, Blackwell's. Who else do you have over there?
Go for it.
I'm missing names. Oh no! But there are lots of British booksellers too. So please do buy the book. Read it.
And
I don't care if you buy it. I want you to read it, but buy it first.
No, it's good. It's good to get the input we've had tonight, actually. Actually, they've started to come in really quickly, and Javier says bravo, and lots of other really lovely people.
Now I'm blushing.
I am, look. It's kind of hot. It's not that hot in London. It's pretty grey. But I should say also Art Newspaper. Please visit the website. Go to the Art Newspaper on all its social media platforms, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Please sign up to the podcast and newsletter. And stay safe, everyone.
Yeah. And more information about my book is all at warholiana.com. It's got additions, corrections, a complete list of all the reviews, and lots of random bits of information about Warhol too. Lately, I've only been posting reviews, but normally I post new insights and facts about Warhol as often as I can.
Okay. Thank you so much again.
Lovely.
Take care.
Was fun. Yeah, you too. Yeah. Stay safe.
Bye-bye. Stay safe. Bye-bye. Bye.